empty fiscal space. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it is interesting to hear the Bloc Québécois supporting the budget policies of the Conservative government, but it is a bit astonishing at the same time, because we were often together with the Bloc to decry the sacking of the Employment Insurance Fund and other points regarding employment insurance funds and other points such as imposing new taxes for airline security that is inflating airline prices in Canada. And we have points on the harmonized sales tax, and the Bloc is not doing anything to get Quebec compensation for this harmonization, and we're very astonished to see the honourable member from Hochelaga to stand up in front of the House and support the budgetary policies of the Conservative Party. But let's look closely at what is in Bill C-47 that the Bloc is supporting, and what is really in the Conservative government's economic policy. Within this context, Mr. Speaker, I was just reading a Reuters article today regarding the Louise Egan affair.
Record high current account gap spurs worry. Alors ça, c'est dans un article de Louise Egan.
This is an article by Louise Egan today from Reuters.
Account deficits in the third quarter, posting the biggest shortfall on record as its worsening trade profile heralded a further slowdown in economic growth. That's today, Mr. Speaker. The country's 8th consecutive quarterly shortfall in the current account, a measure of transactions in goods, services and investment income, totaled $17.54 billion Canadian, compared to a revised quarterly gap of $12.98 billion Canadian, StatsCan said on Monday. Analysts surveyed by Reuters had forecast 15. Now, what's interesting, as we go through it, is that we're getting observations from people like Doug Porter at BMO Capital Markets, who's saying this: Canada suddenly finds its broadest trade deficit in the company of countries that have typically been called as cited as extravagant overspenders, undersavers. He said that when we look at the fact that this may prove to be a passing phase, but it is in fact an early warning that the country may be living beyond its means. In the days leading up to the G20 summit, the world's leading emerging and advanced economies, the U.S. Treasury proposed capping current account surpluses and deficits at 4%. We're above that right now, as a way of achieving a better balance between surplus nations like China and debt-ridden importers like the United States. What we have to look at here is how this fits into the overall budgetary plan of the Conservatives, such as it is. It's probably more of a compliment than they deserve to even mention the word plan when discussing the tragedy that's been visited upon the Canadian economy in the past 5 years since the Conservatives came to power. Mr. Speaker, we occupy the second largest land mass in the world, and we have only 35 million people to try to give that value. That's always required the understanding of a government that placed value on the creation of jobs, placed value on the creation of long-term growth, placed value on the idea that we would try to go into those sectors of the economy that were the most forward-looking and, of course, the most productive. But the Conservatives will have none of that. The Conservative ideology is that anyone who seeks to have the government take a look at the economy and to balance it out and to have it grow long-term and make sense in some ways is trying to pick winners. That's their central thesis, that there's a pristine marketplace that effectuates the best choices in all circumstances. So what we have is an across-the-board tax cut being proposed by the Conservatives since they arrived in power. That's their panacea. That is going to solve all the problems. Well, of course, there is one slight difficulty with that. Any company, especially in the manufacturing field, that was not making a profit hadn't, of course, paid any taxes. So they didn't get anything from the Conservatives' tax decreases. The most profitable companies got those tax decreases. Companies in the oil sectors, people in the banking sector saw the same thing. We're going to see a little bit later this week the most recent quarter of bank profits. But suffice it to say that for the first 9 months of this year, Canada's chartered banks made $15 billion in profit. Now, that's not because they're clever managers. It's because they have a quasi-monopoly and they can charge people basically whatever they want, especially since the Conservatives got there. 25% on your credit card? No problem. Gouging you every time you go to the banking machine? No problem. Why not? As far as the Conservatives are concerned, it's normal to give a tip to the bank president every time you access your own money at an ATM. No, the real problem, Mr. Speaker, is that the Conservatives have been destabilizing the erstwhile balanced economy that Canada had so painstakingly built up since the Second World War. And they're doing it by giving these across-the-board tax cuts, blind to any notion of productivity, blind to any notion of the creation of stable long-term jobs that you can actually afford to raise a family with the salary from. No, that's a thing of the past. As far as they're concerned, let the market decide. So when companies like Encana, companies like Enbridge, get hundreds of millions of dollars in windfall because they've had a reduction in their taxes, we're still hollowing out the manufacturing sector, because what we're doing, of course, is we're superheating the petroleum sector, bringing in an artificially high number of US dollars, putting increasing pressure on the Canadian dollar, something that the textbooks refer to as the Dutch disease after the situation that existed in Holland in the 1960s, where the discovery of gas, of course, meant that there were a large number of foreign currencies that were coming into the country, pushed the guilder ever higher. All of a sudden, the Dutch realized what was supposed to be manna from heaven was in fact destroying their economy because they could no longer afford to export their goods. When we look at today's StatsCan figures, we realize that the only thing the Canadian companies are spending is on equipment coming in from other countries. We can no longer produce on a competitive basis. Our manufacturing sector is being hollowed out. It's interesting to note that StatsCan, shortly after the Conservatives came to power, almost in a defensive statement, I've never seen anything like it from StatsCan, they said, Canada is not suffering from the Dutch disease. So when somebody bothers to use a term like that and then to bother to affirm that it doesn't apply, your radar is automatically starting to ping. You're saying, well, why are they even mentioning it if it's not the case? Very interesting. That statement was made in 2006. Between 2004 and 2008, in other words, in 2008, before the current crisis hit, StatsCan put out new figures that showed precisely the opposite of what they had affirmed 2 years earlier. Between 2004 and 2008, Canada, mostly in Ontario and Quebec, the industrial heartland, had bled off 322,000 good-paying manufacturing jobs. And the prime reason for that is that we've failed to internalize the costs of the oil sands. Instead of taking the fiscal space that was available and trying to help those sectors of the economy that needed it the most, we were giving the money to those sectors of the economy that were already making the largest profits. How did we create the fiscal space for the $60 billion in tax increases that have been given to Canada's most profitable corporations? Not very complicated. The Conservatives finished off the job started by the Liberals. They took $57 billion out of the employment insurance account and they transferred it into general revenues of the government. Now, a lot of people would look at that and say, so what? Who cares? It was government money before and it's government money after. But there's a huge difference, Mr. Speaker. Every company, whether they were making money or losing money, had paid into that EI account, as had every employee. So you had that $57 billion purpose-built, dedicated to take care of the inevitable cyclical aspect of the job market in Canada. And when the recession hit, there would be money there to pay people employment insurance benefits. They had cleaned out the account, and now there was no more money there. There's going to be a $15 billion deficit that's going to have to be paid back again by all companies, whether they're making profits or not, whether they're paying taxes or not. They're going to have this payroll tax for every single job in their company. That's what they did. They created that fiscal space to give the tax decreases to the most profitable corporations by looting the employment insurance account, by taking the money that was there to create the fiscal space to do that. When we talk about sustainable development, the notion that comes most immediately to mind is the environmental aspect. That's, after all, the driving force behind the United Nations report by Brundtland, the former Prime Minister of Norway, who had put together this important report with a view to the Rio summit back in '92. That was a way of saying every time the government had to come to a decision with regard to a problem, you had to look at the environmental, but also at the social and economic aspects. As we've cleaned out the manufacturing sector in Canada, we've shoveled forward onto the backs of future generations not only the environmental debt that we'll talk about in a minute with regard to the tar sands, but we've shoveled a financial and fiscal burden onto their backs. Hundreds of thousands of people will be coming to retirement in the next decades who no longer have a proper pension plan, because at least in the manufacturing sectors, those used to be provided for. We've seen what's happened to companies like Nortel, but more generally, employers who take over companies in Canada with the complicit attitude of the Liberals especially, and the Conservatives, the first thing they go after is the pension plan of their employees. That's for the social aspect. But let's look now at the long-term deficit with regard to the environment and how that's continuing to cause one of the biggest problems in the Canadian economy. You know, Mr. Speaker, that one of the basic principles of sustainable development is that you have to internalize the costs of the environment. These are basic principles like user pay, polluter pay, that you have to make sure that you look at the life cycle analysis of anything that's put on the market. Right now, we are as guilty as a company that's manufacturing a product that's pushing all of its garbage into a river and claims that it's making a good profit because it can sell cheaper, the way we're developing the oil sands, the tar sands. Right now, we have a way of developing them which means that we're not cleaning up the mess, we're not including the price, we're not even including the price of attempts to go after carbon capture and storage. That's being left on the backs of the general tax burden on the backs of every single Canadian. So what we have is an unusual situation. We claim that we have this strategic resource that we're exploiting in the public interest, but in fact what we're doing is leaving a huge environmental burden on the backs of future generations, in addition to the fiscal and financial burden. I talked about the $57 billion looted from the EI account. I talked about the $60 billion in tax reductions for Canada's richest corporations, and it's no coincidence that the Conservatives have also racked up the largest deficit in Canadian history, also to the tune of $60 billion, and the three are, of course, related. If we continue like this, we will have emptied out, hollowed out our manufacturing sector. We will have become, for all intents and purposes, a third world country relying almost exclusively on the exploitation and the extraction of resources that we pump to our neighbours as quickly as possible. That's not a figure of speech. That's literally the case. Mr. Speaker, look at what we've done with the tar sands. We have projects like Keystone, Alberta Clipper, Southern Lights, putting in these pipelines. The Conservatives have had them approved rapidly since they got there. They've scrapped the Navigable Waters Protection Act since they came to power. Just recently, they scrapped the whole environmental assessment process in Canada to send it over to the National Energy Board, which has no experience or expertise in the matter, to make sure that these projects these large energy projects get approved as quickly as possible. Then the North American Free Trade Agreement moves in to provide its impetus in all of this. Under the North American Free Trade Agreement, there is a proportionality clause that means essentially that once we've started exporting in such large quantity to the United States, the raw bitumen, we cannot reduce the quantity we export unless we reduce what we're sending to ourselves. An independent outside analysis of just one of those projects, the Keystone project, concluded that there were 18,000 jobs being exported to the U.S. at the same time because, like a third world country, we don't even add the value here. No processing. Nothing added, no refining. We're not doing anything with it to create permanent long-term jobs here. It's a shameful way of destabilizing the balanced economy that we've built up since the Second World War. And, of course, the government has always had arguments that that's not what's really happening, that those of us who say that the government can and should play a role in building a stable economy, we're trying to pick winners. Well, I put it to you, Mr. Speaker, that they've chosen their winners, and it's the oil companies and the banks. And the people who are going to pay for those lousy choices, instead of looking at the most productive jobs, instead of looking at the most forward-looking parts of the economy, things that could be helping us for the future, creating a system of green renewables across the country, that's all going to be lost. We've had an extraordinary occasion for the past 5 years to do something for future generations, but the vituperative, closed, narrow-minded attitude of the Conservatives has meant that they spew their venom at those who want the government to do something right with the economy. They claim to be doing a good job, but today's papers, today's Reuters article, which will be in various forms in all of the economic papers across Canada tomorrow, prove just the contrary, that what the NDP has been saying for years in this House, that the Conservatives are destroying the balanced economy that Canada built up since the Second World War, is in fact true. C'est pas juste après.
It isn't just something that the NDP is saying. That is, that Canada is being destroyed by the Conservatives' policies. It's being proven by Statistics Canada in its numbers, and that's why the NDP has no difficulty saying that Bill C-47 will never be supported by the NDP, because this represents the overall budget policy of the Conservatives. I listened carefully to the member for Hochelaga earlier, who said that the NDP was going to vote against the budget bill, but we didn't even know why. And I will return the compliment to the member for Hochelaga and just mention that other than the generalities, and he certainly gave us a lot of those then, I would have liked to hear him cite chapter and verse about this bill and tell us what he thinks is good about it. With all that we know about the detrimental impacts of looting the EI fund, how can he support this bill that does this to the EI fund, that imposes new taxes on those who buy airline tickets? How can he support this harmonized sales tax credit without saying anything about the HST harmonization in Quebec? And we know that the Maritimes got harmonization money, and we know that Mr. Landry has said that that Quebec should have got this, and we're hearing now that, well, it doesn't really work the same way, and therefore only the Maritimes get this kind of compensation. But coincidentally, the Maritimes were just about to vote in a general election at the federal level, and therefore it was important. We know what happened after that, but we heard that the rules had once again changed, and so we will again be voting against the Conservatives' budget policies.